Got it. How's that look?
A bit confrontational. Can you try a different angle?
Ma'am, we need to keep this moving. We have to go now.
Are you sure?
Yes.
The trouble
Let's go.
started quietly, the way most property wars do, with tire tracks where they did not belong and a gate that no longer felt like a boundary. The ranch had been mined for years, a stretch of scrub, fencing, and hard-earned peace on the edge of a rapidly suburbanizing town. What used to be open land had been carved into tidy cul-de-sacs and manicured lawns, all governed by a homeowners association that believed rules were a substitute for consent. I had watched the development creep closer season by season, but I never imagined it would roll straight through my front gate like it owned the place. At first, it was just a passing glance. A dark SUV cutting across the gravel drive beyond my gate, moving with the confidence of someone who assumed permission without asking. I told myself it was a mistake, maybe a contractor who had taken a wrong turn. Ranch land tends to confuse people who live by Google Maps and HOA newsletters. But then it happened again, and again, same vehicle, same time of day, same casual disregard for the very visible gate that marked the beginning of private property. The gate itself was not subtle. It was steel-framed, hung with signage, and set back just enough to make it clear that anyone passing through was making a choice. Yet the HOA CEO, a woman whose reputation preceded her long before I learned her name, treated it like a decorative archway. She drove through as if the ranch were an extension of her subdivision, a convenient shortcut between paved order and open land. What made it worse was the way the rest of the HOA board closed ranks around her. The ranch sat adjacent to their newest phase, a luxury cluster marketed with words like rustic and exclusive. They sold the idea of country living without the inconvenience of respecting actual country property lines. Somewhere along the way, the HOA leadership decided that my access road was in spirit, if not in law, theirs to use. Every time the SUV passed through, it chipped away at more than gravel. It eroded the sense of control that comes from owning land. Ranching is about boundaries, not just fences, but understood limits. When those are ignored, everything else starts to feel unstable. Gates are meant to say something simple and final. This one was being treated like a suggestion. I documented everything. Dates, times, tire marks, photos. I read my deed again, then the county plats, then the easement records that had been filed decades earlier. There was no ambiguity. The road beyond the gate belonged to the ranch, not the HOA. There was no shared access, no emergency clause, no gentleman's agreement buried in fine print. Just ownership, clear and unshared. Still, the driving continued. The HOA CEO seemed to take a particular satisfaction in it, showing up more frequently, sometimes twice in a day. It felt deliberate, like a test, the kind of behavior that comes from someone used to winning by persistence rather than by right. The SUV never slowed, never hesitated, never acknowledged the gate as anything more than a mild inconvenience. Neighbors began to notice. Not the HOA residents who benefited from the shortcut, but the ranch hands and adjacent landowners who understood what was happening. They saw the tracks, the dust, the slow normalization of trespass. Everyone knew where this was heading. Once access is taken for granted, it becomes an entitlement. Once it becomes an entitlement, it becomes a fight. I realized then that asking for respect was not going to work. This was not a misunderstanding to be cleared up with a friendly wave or a printed map. This was a power move, a quiet land grab disguised as convenience. The gate had failed in its job, not because it was weak, but because the person crossing it believed rules only applied downward. So I started thinking about permanence, about barriers that did not rely on courtesy, about solutions that could not be ignored or rolled over by confidence in a company SUV. The ranch had always been protected by tradition and mutual understanding, but the HOA did not operate on either. It operated on force of habit and assumed authority. As the dust settled from yet another unauthorized crossing, the idea took shape, solid and unyielding. If a gate was not enough, then something stronger would have to speak for the land. And when it did, there would be no pretending not to understand. The next chapter would begin the moment I decided to stop being patient. Once the decision settled in my mind, patience stopped feeling like a virtue and started feeling like negligence. The ranch had survived droughts, market crashes, and shifting county lines, but it was not built to survive being treated like a communal driveway by people who mistook authority for ownership. Every day I waited, the HOA CEO's behavior became more normalized, more embedded, and more difficult to undo. The gate was no longer a warning, it had become a prop. I made one last attempt at restraint, not out of hope, but out of obligation. I sent a formal notice to the HOA board, not emotional, not confrontational, just factual. It laid out the property boundaries, referenced recorded deeds, and clearly stated that there was no legal right of passage through the ranch. It requested that all HOA representatives cease using the access road immediately. No threats, no raised voice. Just the kind of document that should have ended the situation if reason mattered. It didn't. The response came quickly, and it said everything without saying much at all. The HOA CEO replied on behalf of the board, framing the issue as a temporary access concern, and suggesting that my gate interfered with community flow. She referenced safety, convenience, and neighborly cooperation, all while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of ownership. It was written in the language of someone used to talking over people rather than with them. The driving didn't stop. If anything, it escalated. The SUV began appearing earlier in the morning and later in the evening. Other vehicles followed, emboldened by the example set at the top: a maintenance truck, a real estate agent's sedan, once even a golf cart, wobbling confidently through ranch land like it belonged there. Each crossing was another brick laid in a road that was never theirs. What struck me most was the performance of it all. The HOA CEO no longer drove through casually. She slowed slightly at the gate, just enough to make eye contact if anyone was around, then continued forward anyway. It was a calculated show of dominance, the kind meant to establish precedent through repetition. In her world, whoever acted first and loudest usually won. But ranch land doesn't respond to volume. It responds to weight, to permanence, to things that do not move just because someone expects them to. I consulted with a surveyor, then an attorney, not because I doubted my position, but because I wanted it fortified from every angle. The survey stakes went in like punctuation marks, reaffirming boundaries that had existed long before the OA's glossy brochures. The legal opinion was clear and almost bored in its certainty. Trespass was trespass. Repetition did not turn it into a right. That was when the idea of steel bollards stopped being theoretical. Bollards were not dramatic, they were not flashy, they didn't shout. They simply existed, immovable and unapologetic. Where a gate invited debate, bollards ended it. They couldn't be pushed aside, driven around, or reinterpreted as flexible. They spoke a language the HOA CEO understood instinctively. Limitation enforced by physics. The plan came together quickly. Placement was key. The spacing had to allow ranch equipment through while preventing passenger vehicles from slipping between. The depth had to be sufficient to make removal impractical without heavy machinery and permits. Everything was measured, documented, and aligned with county regulations. There would be no loopholes to exploit. As preparations began, word filtered back through the informal channels that always exist in small communities. The HOA residents started to realize that the shortcut they'd been enjoying was about to disappear. Some were annoyed, others were confused. A few were angry, not at the board that had overstepped, but at the ranch that was daring to enforce its own boundaries, and hovering over all of it was the HOA CEO, whose confidence had not yet cracked, but whose actions were becoming sharper, more frantic. She drove through the gate again the day before installation was scheduled, slower than ever, lingering like someone taking one last look at something they assumed would always be theirs. She was wrong. As the sun set over the ranch that evening, the ground marked and the materials staged, it was clear that the next crossing attempt would not end the way the others had. The land was about to answer back, and it would not do so politely. The next chapter would begin the moment steel met soil. The morning the Bollards went in felt different from the start. There was no uncertainty left, no internal debate about whether this was too much or too far. The ranch woke up to the sound of equipment instead of engines cutting across land that wasn't theirs. The installation crew worked methodically, drilling deep into the soil where the access road narrowed just beyond the gate. Each hole represented a final answer to a question that had been asked one too many times. Steel posts were lowered into place, thick and industrial, the kind designed to stop trucks, not just discourage sedans. Concrete followed, filling the gaps and locking the bollards into the earth like teeth clenched shut. This was not a temporary measure. It was a line drawn in materials that did not negotiate. By mid-morning, the gate still stood open, but the road beyond it was no longer passable. From a distance, the bollards didn't look aggressive. They looked official, intentional. The sort of thing that made it immediately obvious that someone with authority had decided enough was enough. The first reaction came faster than expected. The familiar dark SUV appeared just before noon, approaching the gate with the same unhurried confidence it always had. It rolled forward, slowed, and then stopped abruptly when the driver finally processed what had changed. For the first time, the vehicle didn't continue through. It sat there, idling, boxed in by reality. From the ranch house, the moment was impossible to miss. The SUV crept forward inches at a time, testing angles that didn't exist. The spacing was precise. No car could fit through without damage, and no amount of entitlement could change that. After several minutes of indecision, the vehicle reversed sharply, gravel spraying in frustration, and retreated the way it came. The silence afterward was loud. Within the hour, the emails started. The OACO fired off messages marked urgent, accusing the ranch of creating a hazard, of blocking previously established access, of acting without consultation. The tone was indignant and credulous, as if the mere presence of steel posts was a personal insult. She demanded immediate removal and hinted at legal consequences, leaning heavily on the assumption that escalation would force compliance. But escalation cuts both ways. I responded once, briefly attaching the survey, the legal opinion, and photos documenting repeated trespass. There was no apology, no justification beyond the facts. The bollards were installed entirely on private property. There was no right-of-way. There would be no removal. That was when the public campaign began. The HOA CEO took to community forums and email blasts, painting the ranch as hostile and uncooperative. She framed the bollards as an attack on the neighborhood, an act of aggression against community harmony. She omitted the part where her own vehicle had been driving through private land for months without permission. Omission, in her world, was just another tool. Residents began showing up at the gate, not crossing it now, but standing near it, taking photos, shaking heads. Some treated it like a spectacle, others like a grievance. A few tried to argue from the road, gesturing at the bollards as if outrage could make them disappear. But none crossed the line because for the first time the line was undeniable. Then came the inspection threats. The HOA CEO hinted that the ranch would soon face scrutiny from county officials, from environmental regulators, from anyone who could be convinced to look for a problem. It was retaliation dressed up as responsibility, a familiar move from someone used to wielding bureaucracy as a weapon. What she didn't anticipate was how visible her overreach had become. The bollards didn't just block cars. They exposed behavior. They forced a confrontation between assumed power and actual ownership. Every failed attempt to pressure, shame, or intimidate only reinforced the original point: the HOA had mistaken proximity for control. As the day ended, the gate stood unchanged, the bollards casting long shadows across the road that was no longer a shortcut. The ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, charged with the knowledge that the fight had entered a new phase. The days following the installation felt less like a property dispute and more like a siege conducted entirely on letterhead. When the HOA CEO realized that outrage and public shaming weren't moving the steel an inch, she pivoted to the weapon she trusted most: paperwork. Official-looking notices began arriving with alarming regularity, each one framed as a concern, a warning, or a request for compliance that carried the weight of authority she didn't actually have. The first letter claimed the bollards violated community design standards. It cited aesthetic harmony, sightlines, and the supposed impact on neighborhood character. None of it applied to land outside the OA's jurisdiction, but the language was dense enough to confuse anyone unfamiliar with property law. That confusion was the point. The goal wasn't to win on merit, it was to exhaust. Next came the safety angle. The HOA CEO alleged that emergency vehicles might need access through the ranch, despite there being no such route designated in any county plan. She referenced hypothetical disasters, painted vivid scenarios, and positioned herself as the protector of the community. It was dramatic, strategic, and entirely unmoored from reality. County offices were contacted, inspectors were requested, complaints were filed. Each one triggered a small ripple of activity: a phone call here, an email there. But every inquiry ended the same way, with officials confirming that the ranch was in compliance and the HOA had no authority beyond its mapped boundaries. The paper war was producing smoke, but no fire. What changed the dynamic was visibility. One of the inspectors, frustrated by the volume of baseless complaints, mentioned offhandedly that the OA CEO was becoming a familiar name in the county system. Repetition has consequences. When the same source files enough meritless reports, patterns emerge and patience wears thin. The very tactics meant to intimidate were quietly undermining her credibility. Meanwhile, the HOA residents began to fracture. Not everyone appreciated being used as leverage in a personal power struggle. Some started asking questions about why the board had ever implied access rights that didn't exist. Others wondered aloud whether the legal bills piling up were worth a shortcut that saved a few minutes of driving. The HOA CEO responded by tightening her grip. Communications became more controlled, dissent less tolerated. She framed any internal questioning as disloyalty, positioning herself as the only thing standing between the community and chaos. It was a familiar pattern, one that worked best when fear outweighed facts. On the ranch side, things stayed calm. Documentation continued. Cameras recorded activity around the gate. Every interaction, every attempt at interference was logged. There was no rush, no reactive move. The steel did its job and time began to do the rest. Then came the cease and desist letter. It arrived with theatrical flair, sent by an attorney whose name carried weight in HOA circles. The letter accused the ranch of interfering with established access, demanded immediate removal of the Bollards, and threatened legal action. It was the most aggressive move yet, and it was meant to scare. Instead, it clarified everything. A single response went back, this time from my own attorney, dismantling the claims point by point. The tone was clinical, almost indifferent. It cited statutes, precedent, and the complete absence of any easement. It concluded by inviting the HOA to proceed with litigation if they wished, noting that continued trespass or harassment would be counterclaimed. After that, something shifted. The OA CEO went quiet. Not completely, but noticeably. The flood of notices slowed. The public post stopped. The SUV no longer approached the gate, as if acknowledging at last that the shortcut was gone for good. But silence from someone like her never meant surrender. It meant recalculation. As the ranch settled into an uneasy calm, it became clear that the conflict had moved from open confrontation to something more subtle. The steel had held. The law had held. Now it was a question of what would happen when control slipped from someone who had built her identity around never losing. The quiet didn't last, but it lingered just long enough to feel intentional. For weeks after the cease and desist collapsed under its own weight, the ranch heard nothing from the HOA leadership. No emails, no complaints, no vehicles idling at the gate. To anyone watching from the outside, it might have looked like the dispute was over. But silence in this context wasn't peace. It was planning. The next move came sideways. Instead of approaching the ranch directly, the HOA CEO began working through intermediaries. Adjacent landowners received calls framed as friendly check-ins that somehow drifted toward questions about shared access and historical use. Longtime residents were asked to recall vague memories of always driving through there, as if repetition could rewrite recorded history. It was an attempt to manufacture tradition where none existed. At the same time, rumors began circulating within the community. The ranch was supposedly planning major development. The Bollards were just the first step in a broader plan to cut the neighborhood off. None of it was true, but truth was never the goal. The goal was to turn uncertainty into pressure, to make the ranch the problem instead of the boundary violator. What the HOA CEO underestimated was how tired people were. The board members, many of whom had initially deferred to her confidence, were now fielding questions they couldn't answer. Legal costs were rising. County officials were no longer receptive. The shortcut was gone, and life had gone on. The conflict, once framed as a community necessity, was starting to look like a personal crusade. That was when the emergency meeting was called. It was advertised as a discussion about infrastructure and access, but everyone knew why it was happening. The HOA CEO needed a mandate, something she could point to as justification for continuing the fight. She needed to reclaim authority that had been slipping through her fingers ever since the Bollards went in. The meeting didn't go the way she planned. Residents asked for specifics. They asked for documents. They asked why the board had never disclosed that there was no legal easement through the ranch. They asked why dues were being used to pursue a fight that had already failed on every front. Each question chipped away at the narrative she had built. The HOA CEO responded with the same tactics that had worked in the past: deflection, urgency, warnings about future problems if her leadership was questioned. But the room had changed. The fear wasn't sticking. People had seen the limits of her power, and once those limits are visible, they can't be unseen. Outside the HOA, the ranch remained steady. The gate stayed open, the Bollards unmoved. There were no retaliatory gestures, no public statements. The land didn't need to argue. It had already made its point. The breaking moment came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a resignation. One of the board members stepped down, citing discomfort with the direction the HOA had taken. It was a small act, but it sent a clear signal. Loyalty was no longer guaranteed. Authority was no longer absolute. Within days, the AACO's tone shifted again, this time toward conciliation. She floated the idea of collaboration, of revisiting the issue with fresh eyes. The language was softer, but the intent was transparent. She needed an exit that didn't look like defeat. No response came from the ranch. There was nothing left to discuss. As the HOA's internal cohesion continued to erode, it became clear that the dispute had outgrown the gate, the road, and even the land itself. It had become a lesson in what happens when assumed control collides with a movable reality. By the time the 6th month rolled around, the conflict had settled into something that resembled normalcy. But only because the HOA CEO had exhausted every avenue she could think of. The steel bollards remained, silent sentinels marking the line between entitlement and ownership. The SUV never approached the gate again, and the road that had once been a shortcut for the community had become nothing more than gravel, dust, and a story everyone whispered about but rarely revisited. The HOA itself had changed. The internal fractures were visible to anyone paying attention. Members who had once deferred unquestioningly to the CEO's authority were now openly questioning her decisions. Meetings were tense and brief, focused on tangible concerns like landscaping, maintenance, and budgets, rather than imagined crises that required manufactured urgency. The board was smaller, quieter, more cautious. The aura of unchallenged power had evaporated, leaving behind only the trappings of routine governance. The CEO, predictably, tried to maintain her position. She continued to send occasional memos and public posts warning residents about potentially contentious property issues in the area, hinting at dangers only she seemed to perceive. But without the dramatic gesture of crossing the ranch gate or the leverage of a threatened route, her warnings felt hollow. People listened, then carried on with their lives. Fear, after all, only works if it is real, or at least believed to be real. Once discredited, it becomes background noise. On the ranch side, life returned to its rhythm. The Bollards, though silent, had accomplished more than simply blocking vehicles. They had transformed the relationship between the ranch and the HOA from one of constant skirmish to one of unambiguous boundaries. There were still signs of trespass occasionally, footprints, misplaced debris, but nothing approached the deliberate arrogance of the SUV slicing through the gate. Each trace was documented, a reminder that vigilance remained necessary, but nothing required immediate confrontation. The land itself had spoken clearly, and now the world had learned to listen. Neighbors slowly came to understand the full scope of what had happened. Some were sympathetic to the ranch's position, impressed by the combination of strategic planning, legal preparation, and physical deterrence. Others felt the HOA had overreached, recognizing that the CEO had created an unnecessary spectacle, wasting time and money on a conflict that never should have existed. Rumors circulated about the legal consultations, the surveyors and the Bollards themselves elevating the story into almost a local legend, the tale of how a single property line and a little steel brought a powerful OA to heel. Even the CEO's attempts at recovery fell flat. She tried to rebrand her leadership style as collaborative, but credibility had a half-life. Residents quietly ignored her advisories about access rights, and when she attempted to remind them of her authority in public forums, the response was polite skepticism rather than fear or compliance. The gate had drawn the line and the Bollards had reinforced it. Physical, legal, and social boundaries had aligned. Authority without justification could no longer thrive in that space, and yet there was an almost poetic quiet to it all. No dramatic confrontation marked the final chapter. No court case, no shouts across the gravel, no vehicles trying and failing to squeeze through. The story ended with steel in the ground, legal documents in files, and a community slowly recognizing limits it hadn't understood before. Sometimes, the most decisive victories aren't the loudest, they are the ones that make further struggle irrelevant. The ranch stood as it always had, unshaken by the noise, the emails, and the ultimatums. The gate no longer symbolized vulnerability, it represented resolve. The Bollards were more than steel, they were a statement, an immovable answer to a repeated question: this land will not bend to assumptions, shortcuts, or the arrogance of a self-appointed authority. Ownership had been asserted, boundaries had been respected. Peace, in its quietest form, had returned, and so the story concluded not with revenge, not with spectacle, but with the enduring lesson that some lines, once drawn, cannot be crossed without consequence. The HOA learned it the hard way, and the ranch endured, as it always would, because some boundaries are meant to be absolute. The gate stayed open for those who belonged and closed firmly and finally for those who did not.